The McLaren Senna is a sensational track car. I know this because I've driven it round Estoril in Portugal, where Ayrton Senna had his famous first Formula 1 win in 1985. But what makes the eponymous car's track performance so impressive is that it has number plates, and you can pop out of the pit lane and round the corner to pick up a pint of milk. So, while we could have done a road test in the south of France or the Pyrenees, I wanted to put this extraordinary car through a very real-world evaluation. Something as removed from a racetrack as possible. I wanted to do a drive across the rough and tumble of the B roads of England, to see its alien form amongst ordinary shaped traffic, juxtaposed with thatched cottages. In isolation, on a circuit or in a studio where I first saw it, yes, it looks outlandish, but here, next to a late 90s Corsa or an old Peugeot estate parked up at a level crossing, it just looks like an alien spaceship. It is extraordinary. Still ugly, but extraordinary. What must they be thinking? It's a bit like high fashion. You see pictures of an outrageous outfit on the catwalk, and sure, you think, bet that's dry clean only. But if you saw someone walking down the street in it, you'd think they were insane. Who knows, perhaps a racily cut combination of taffeta and wetsuit fabric married to 6-inch heels could be the perfect thing for a wet Wednesday in Wigan. But surely a 789 brake horsepower car with nearly slick rubber and a wing the width of a sofa isn't going to work on a bumpy B road, is it?
I really wasn't sure how this car would feel on the road. I thought it could feel a bit like trying to use a Hasselblad to take holiday snaps. But almost as soon as I got into it, I was enjoying it far more than I expected. The thing I was most impressed with on the track was the braking performance. It takes you a couple of pushes just to get used to how hard you have to lean on that left-hand pedal. But once you're used to it, it's something you can use again and again on the road and really revel in. More so than the 789 brake horsepower. One thing that hasn't really got any better out with the track is the noise of the engine, which is, well, sort of brutalist and a bit industrial. Effective it is, beautiful it is not. Then there's the view out. McLaren's have really got that right from the word go. But this one, with the addition of these panels down here and these ones up in the roof, no, you don't find yourself looking down at the curb very often, but just aware of them in your peripheral vision. So they add to this extremely light feeling in here. Light and lightweight, because this car does feel like it only weighs 1,200 kilos. Given that it's capable of 0 to 62 miles an hour in 2.8 seconds and 0 to 186 miles an hour in well under 20 seconds, you have to be pretty judicious with how you use the throttle. You worry that a car with so much aero might not be fun on the road, but with nearly 800 brake horsepower, of course it is! With traction control on, this car keeps everything very well reined in. If you turn to ESC dynamic, then it really does come alive. This is brilliant. This is so much better than I thought it would be on the road. Yes, you might only be using a fraction of its performance, but what it serves up is so involving.
There is another reason for wanting to drive this car on these Middle England roads too. You see, Senna himself spent several years living in Britain, starting in 1981, the year I was born, driving Formula Ford 1600. At one point he had a bungalow in Norwich, and later he bought a house in Esher in Surrey. So I like to imagine that he dashed along lanes just like these to Silverstone or Snetterton, Brands Hatch or Thruxton, Mallory or Alton. I know that early on he had a silver Alphazud, then an Escort XR3, then later a Mercedes. Quite what he would have made of this, I really don't know.
And just in case you think this is all a bit of a flight of fancies, Senna herring across the country, let me tell you a bit of a story. Dennis Russian was the team manager of his Formula Ford 2000 team in 1982. Senna was racing at Donington one day in early April and won the race. And he wandered up to Dennis afterward, garland around his neck, and said, let's go to Snetterton. My friend Mauricio is racing there in an hour and a half. Now, it was a 2.5 hour drive across to Snetterton from Donington. So Dennis said, we'll never make it. Yes, we will, said Ayrton. Dennis had a Mazda at the time. He sat in the front, Spider the mechanic sat in the back. And sure enough, they made it in just over the hour and a half to see the race. Apparently Dennis sat with a book in front of his face most of the time, so he couldn't see the things that were happening.
Today we're going in the other direction, heading like a homing pigeon towards Donington, in order to remember what is arguably Senna's greatest ever lap. In 1993, after an absence of a few years, the European Grand Prix came here, to Donington Park. I was 11 years old at the time and I remember it well, partly because I was F1 mad, partly because it was sponsored by computer games producer Sega. Anyway, in qualifying it was dry and everything went to the form book, with the Williams of Prost and Hill locking out the front row. Third was Schumacher and fourth was Senna. Come race day, however, there was a torrential downpour. What happened next made a lasting impression on anyone that saw it. The distinctive red and white car at Donington in 1993 was this, a McLaren MP48. Like today's McLaren Senna, it has a V8, although its displacement is 3.5 as opposed to 4 litres, and it does without the road car's turbochargers. As a result, its 680 brake horsepower lags some 100 brake horsepower behind the Senna, but weighing just 505 kilos, the F1 car is less than half the weight of the still light road car. Both have paddle-operated gear shifts, the F1 car making do with 1 clutch and 6 ratios to the road cars 2 and 7. And as this was the height of the era of electronic assistance in Formula 1, so both cars have trick suspension and traction control, although the modern car is the only one with active aerodynamics. Both, of course, have a carbon fibre chassis, and today, the modern road car is going to follow in the wheel tracks of the iconic race car. Comparing today's circuit with that of 1993 is easy, as Donington Park's 2.5 miles and 12 corners remain pretty much identical in 2019, although today they are considerably drier. As for the drivers, well, I have 2 legs and 2 arms, just like Ayrton Senna, but sadly that's pretty much where the comparisons end. However, I'll do my very best. Fourth on the grid means Senna is on the left-hand side of the track, next to the pit wall. When the lights go out, Ayrton is actually slow away, losing the place as Carl Wendling gets up to third. On the run down to Redgate, Michael Schumacher runs Senna out wide into the pit lane exit, but Ayrton dives right and slots up the inside of the Benetton Ford on the brakes. Back to fourth. Next is perhaps the most extraordinary overtake. As the train of cars sweeps downhill through the intimidatingly fast Crenna curves, Ayrton stays wide in the wet and passes the Sauber of Wendlinger around the outside of the right handle. It's a sensational reading of the track and the available grip. Third place is his. Such is Senna's speed that he isn't even compromised through the old hairpin, and on the run up to the next corner he's all over the gearbox of Damon Hill's Williams Renault. As a result, it's like taking candy from a baby as he easily slips down the inside under braking into McLaren's. He's now up to second. Hill struggles for traction on the exit, but Senna is smoothly away and hunting down his final quarry, Alain Prost. The Frenchman is no slouch in the rain, and Senna has ground to make up out of Coppice and down Starkey Straight. The Williams ahead sparking over the slight crest halfway down. Through the slow-speed S's onto the Melbourne Loop, then Senna dives out of the spray and squirms down the inside on the brakes. First place, from 5th, into the lead in less than 1 lap. Extraordinary. And that last overtake down here into the Melbourne hairpin was of course the one that Senna really wanted, because it was Prost. Halfway through the overtake you can see the Frenchman glance across to his right, almost incredulous at seeing the Brazilian there on his inside. The rest of the race, well, it was very much a case of it being mixed conditions, I think you'd say. Wet, then dry, then wet again. And Senna was a master of those conditions, as he always had been. He made fewer pit stops than his nearest rivals and came out on top. Hill was in second place that day, over a minute behind. Everyone else, including Prost, had lapped. For me though, it's that single first lap that encapsulates so much of what made Senna special. It highlighted his ability to go straight from the gun, extracting speed from cold tyres when others were feeling their way more tentatively into the unknown. It also showcased his skill in the wet, whether it was Snetterton in 81, Monaco in 84, Estoril in 85 or Donington in 93, Senna had the ability to make the rest of a grid look like amateurs when there was moisture in the air. And finally, it was fitting that the lap should culminate in an overtake on Prost, the supreme rival who helped define the Brazilian's career. Of course, just over a year later, in 1994, the world would lose Ayrton Senna da Silva for good, on the same weekend as Roland Ratzenberger. I remember that weekend also so well. It's emblazoned on my mind. But I prefer to remember Senna for that day in 1993, and specifically that first lap here at Donington.